Welcome, everybody, to the Saphira Center of Shamanism, where we break down the ancient esoteric practices of shamanism and the occult, bringing them into balance with the deep psyche. My name is Luke, experienced practitioner and mentor of the shamanic and occult sciences. It is an honor to have you here. Thank you for joining me once again. Be sure to find me over on Patreon, first link within the description of this video. There are lots of tiers to choose from that grant you access to different levels of exclusive content, as well as different levels of access to me. The first two tiers grant you access to the core exclusive content, over 300 pieces of exclusive content, with new content uploaded multiple times each week. The tiers after tier 2, tier 3 and upwards are very much for those who are wanting access to more advanced initiatory content, as well as more direct access to me. Tiers 3 and higher grant you access to my initiation and training webinars. I am running a temporary Black Friday discount, 15%, until next week, so definitely check that out. First link in the description, but access starts at just £20 per month. I look forward to seeing you there. So, today, I'm going to be speaking about something that I have been anticipating for a while, but I haven't been at the point in my process whereby I feel ready to truly reflect on this, simply because I will be speaking about my process of initiation through the Qliphothic sphere workings. Now, when I speak about my process, I'm doing this for multiple reasons. Being completely transparent, it's immensely therapeutic for me to voice this to an audience that understands. But I'm also doing this for those who are wanting to comprehend their experiences in the Qliphoth, or for those who are considering going into it themselves. Understand that as I share my experiences, do not attach to what I am saying. Okay, this Qliphoth is highly individual. You will not, by any means whatsoever, experience the same as what I have experienced. You will not experience the same as what somebody else has experienced. The Qliphoth is an advanced infernal initiation system that has the role of rupturing your predefined identity. So you go through a series of intense initiatory trials and archetypal processes of shadow integration in order to get you to integrate your core karmic trauma. And when I say karmic trauma, I mean the trauma that you have basically come into this world with, that has then been amplified and set into motion by the things that you have experienced in your early years. Because everybody's karma is different in their microcosm, what you experience in the Qliphoth is going to be so individual. So when I share my experiences, use it as a guidance system and don't bind yourself to it. Don't say, oh God, no, I'm not going to go into the Qliphoth because that sounds really hard or that sounds really difficult. Don't be like, oh yeah, no, I might experience that. Don't go in thinking that you are going to experience the same things that I did. Understand that your process is your process. Now, I am speaking specifically about the Qliphothic sphere workings, which is the most common form of infernal initiation within Western occultism. Now, the Qliphothic sphere workings are the series of initiations that go through the 10 core Qliphothic spheres, with the addition of crossing the Daath, the abyss. You move from the Earth sphere, Nahemoth, up to the top sphere, which is Thaumiel, and you undergo potent transmutation as you embody each planetary energy and the demonic archetype that rules over that given sphere. Now, I'm not speaking about here the process that unfolds after the Qliphothic sphere workings, because this is it's what I'm going through currently at this moment in time, and it's so beyond comprehension that it's hard to really put into words. But what I'm going to be describing is the process of initiation through the 10 Qliphothic sphere workings, with the addition of crossing the abyss, taking you through some of the things that I experienced. It's impossible to note all of the individual experiences day to day, but I'm going to be doing my best to describe my process going through the sphere workings and basically what my process was like, what I was experiencing, the core initiatory trials that I experienced, and different things like that, so that you can get an idea of what this initiatory process actually is and what it does. Now, I've touched on my experiences in previous videos, but I've never shared it in full. So this is me being very open and very vulnerable to my audience here on YouTube, to also help me to further integrate and comprehend my experiences in the tree itself. But before I go into it, understand that the Qliphoth is a very serious initiatory process. This is shadow work on steroids. It is very challenging. It is quite intense. And you have to be prepared. It should go without saying, especially if you watch my channel regularly. I've made loads of videos on the Qliphoth and the different Qliphothic spheres, but it should go without saying at this point that you need to be adequately prepared. You need to have a solid set of foundational protocols so that you can effectively ground what you are tapping into. The Qliphoth is not a process that ever ends either. You can go through the Qliphothic spheres, but the core initiations happen after, okay? The Qliphothic trials that you experience are only the training ground when you go through the Qliphothic spheres. They are training you how to release predefined identity and operate in the void which is beyond the Qliphoth. So understand that the Qliphothic sphere workings are only the first part of the initiation. What is beyond the Qliphothic spheres is endless processes of initiation through the trans-Qliphothic void. If you take the path of the stellar outlands, then you'll be embarking on the regions of initiation that are beyond the Qliphothic spheres themselves, not to mention the tunnels of Set, which are the tunnels that interconnect, the pathways that interconnect the spheres themselves, as well as the veils of negative existence, the trans-Qliphothic labyrinth, and the ongoing initiation process that unfolds after. So when I talk about my experiences, I'm only talking about the sphere workings and crossing the abyss. What happens after is going to be far more personal, much more incomprehensible, and far less tangible. So understand that as I speak about this process of initiation, it is only the training ground for what is to come. So definitely stay tuned as we dive into my experiences initiating through the Qliphothic sphere workings. How did I find out about the Qliphoth? So I found out about the Qliphoth simply through my work with demonolatry-based practices. I started working with demons when I was about 3.5 years into my shamanic initiation process. Now, my shamanic initiation process was quite extensive. It's a system of initiation that has the purpose of basically shifting your nervous system and energetic body back into the cycle of death and rebirth. In other words, reconnecting your system to the natural flow of nature. The path working is very simple, but it takes quite a long time. You move from one archetype to the next archetype and to the next archetype and to the next archetype, each one resonating with a different direction of one of the 4 cardinal directions. This process absolutely stood me in very good stead to be able to ground my Qliphothic initiation process because of how extensive this initiation process was and how long it took. Literally takes like 4 to 4.5 years to complete this initiation process. I had the right level of patience, presence, and lack of urgency to be able to go into the Qliphoth and not be destabilized by the energies. I also went through very specific ego-shattering experiences within my process through the medicine wheel that I later found out were preparing me for the work of the Qliphoth. Long story short, I approach my Qliphothic initiation process in a very specific way. I go to my final shamanic training retreat, which is the training retreats were done in the form of small groups, and you would go receive the teachings and then go away and integrate. So this was the final training, the final training retreat, which we would call the East, which is the eagle archetype, all about transcendence. And whilst I am on that retreat, I receive a text from my mother saying that her cancer was now terminal and that it had spread to her lymph nodes. Okay, so basically it was in her tonsil and then it spread down to the lymph nodes and started basically growing out of the neck. Okay, both sides as well. So that was a big ego-shattering initiation. That was a direct call towards the Qliphoth. As soon as I heard this information, I felt the Qliphothic energy strongly and a very strong inner knowing that now was the time. Because my entire reality was about to fall apart anyway, and I might as well go into the Qliphoth to actually learn how to work with these energies consciously. Otherwise, I just would have experienced more re-traumatizing shit. This is the thing. This is how it often works if you are called into the Qliphothic process. If you're called into the Qliphothic process, you are very, very likely going to find it through rupture. Okay, and it's going to get to the point where it follows you around, and it's almost like you don't really have a choice as to whether to go into it or not. It's kind of like the mindset that I had at the point where I was about to go into the Qliphoth was like, if I don't go into the Qliphoth, then I'm going to still be experiencing these energies anyway. And this is how the Qliphothic energy works. You either face it consciously and learn how to use it for your benefit, or you ignore it and then remain a slave to it. You know, and not everybody is supposed to work with Qliphothic energy in this lifetime. Not everybody is aligned to that path completely. So that news completely triggered my desire to go into the Qliphoth, okay? And I was very nervous to do so. The final shamanic ritual was what we call a burial ritual, which is basically where you spend the day digging your own grave, literally in the ground, and then you prepare to go into the grave overnight. And my process of entering the Qliphoth happened after I had spent the whole day digging my own grave, and basically happened when I was about to go into the grave. Okay, about to go into the grave overnight. I thought there is no better time to do it than to enter the Earth sphere and actually go into the Earth with a board over me overnight. Okay, so it really tied into the ending of my shamanic training and then the start of my occult initiatory process. So I did the ritual to open up Nahemoth. This was about an hour before I was due to go into the ground overnight. Now, the initiatory ritual that I used was Enoch Petrocelli's method in his book, The Black Witch. Highly recommend. I used that method to open up Nahemoth, and the moment I opened the gate, the energy basically entered me directly and completely floored my whole system from the moment of entering into it. It was like I'd never felt anything so tangible other than when I had initiated with Beelzebub or invoked Beelzebub consistently. So the energy came into my system and I started to get this like hollowing like sensation in my ears. It was literally like it was like a walk, 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 like in my ears, like very faint. And I was like, I knew from that moment that everything in my life was now going to be impacted by the Qliphothic tree and that there was no turning back now. But in my initiation process, I was met by both Lilith and Naamah that was kind of molding into the same being and then into separate forces. And they were very welcoming. They would say, look, you're going to be okay. You're going to be absolutely fine. You are well prepared for this process. So then I moved from where I was doing the ritual, and instantly I felt completely out of harmony and alignment with my mentors, okay, and with everybody else that was at the shamanic training retreat, thinking that it was the end of their journey. I was literally just there being like, I already don't resonate with this anymore. The instant shift in consciousness. When you enter a Qliphothic sphere, it triggers an immediate elevation in consciousness, an immediate shift in consciousness, and it is then going to anchor in specific types of experiences. So I went into the ground overnight. They laid me in the ground, put a board over me, and I was laying there in the ground overnight with the Qliphothic energy of Nahemoth flowing through me. I must say it was epic, and I actually slept very well down there. Okay, and I tend to sleepwalk, so I literally like opened the grave at one point. I was going to get out of it in my sleep, and then I realized that I was still asleep and things like that. So the process started perfectly by experiencing a very deep rupture in my physical experience, my mother's cancer becoming terminal. And because my mother was such a core aspect of both my life, a core foundation of my life, and a core foundation of my trauma, the ground shook. And that was the time for me to enter into the Qliphoth. Spent the night underground, came out of the ground, and actually felt very good the next day. But my mum was then in a tremendous amount of pain. So I then made the journey back from where I was. I was in Norfolk in the UK, and then went back to Sussex, where my mother lives. I also lived in Sussex, but in a separate place. And literally within the first day of entering into Nahemoth, I was in the process of moving back in with my mum, because my mum couldn't work. She could barely talk. There was cancer basically starting to fungate out of her neck. And she basically she needed support. Okay, so I moved back in with her to support her process, okay, and also to help out with the bills. So I took on the bills and was basically moving back with the intention to be supportive to my mother. This was something that I never thought that I would do, even if her cancer got really bad. So the perceptual shift of Nahemoth triggered an immediate restructuring of my physical experience, whereby I was moving from my very cushy apartment into the same bedroom that I was living in as an adolescent. Whereas everything that I was doing before was essentially, without even realizing it, running away. Okay, I was running away from my trauma by moving to different places and things like that. I just didn't consciously realize that I was doing it. Nahemoth made it very clear that in order for me to trigger the evolution that I needed and to be supportive to my mum, I needed to move back into the same place as her. Bearing in mind, she lived in a masonette, which is basically an apartment with its own entrance. And the place is not big. It only had 2 bedrooms. And we also had an elderly dog to look after as well. The dog I still have to this day. So this basically triggered a big restructuring of my physical experience. Naamah is the Black Earth. Nahemoth, ruled by Naamah, is the Black Earth. And I was experiencing all kinds of different sensations in the body whilst my physical reality was shifting. So what you will probably experience one way or another in Nahemoth is a restructuring of your reality into the right vessel to be able to carry out the later stages of the initiation. And Nahemoth triggered the perfect reconstruction of my reality to literally feel like I was a teenager again. Now, why did Nahemoth influence me into living back with my mother? Not only was it to support her, but it was also to move me back into the enmeshment dynamic of my past. Now, what the Qliphoth will do is that it will orchestrate your reality to get you to basically purify the core karma that you have basically accumulated through past lives, but the core karmic identity that you are rupturing is from this life, which means that you are going to experience different trials that are going to resonate with your core past trauma, whatever that may be. And it will be different likely to what you think it was. For me, my core past trauma was built from enmeshment trauma, which is basically I was enmeshed into my mum's story. She would blame me for things. I was an only child. So a lot of my identity was built around my mother. Okay, my sense of self was established to accommodate my mother's emotional needs. I didn't realize it before entering the Qliphoth, but it was immensely toxic. And this is what you realize in the Qliphoth one way or another, that the reality that you were living before was serving you, but it was actually built from a lot of toxicity that you did not actually realize. Okay, so Nahemoth showed me that my core trauma was enmeshment-based trauma, and that I needed to go back into what I would call at the time the scorpion's nest, my mother's house, where I grew up to experience the same as I did as a child, but also have the opportunity to experience the opposite. So my whole Qliphothic initiation process was then orchestrated to witness my mother slowly dying from cancer. Okay, this was the initiatory theme that was unfolding throughout my whole process. And to witness somebody that close to you dying and not being able to speak in immense pain every single day, not being able to eat, not being able to drink soup without coughing it up out of the nose, it was pretty brutal, to be honest. Every single day, I was in an environment that was resonant with my core past trauma, but in a way that was much more intense and much more raw and much more unfiltered, because I was enmeshed into my mum's story anyway. So to see her suffering without me being able to do anything about it, there is no greater initiation out of enmeshment trauma than to be in that given dynamic. And my mother's nature, she was immensely loving, but she was also in a bit of a narcissistic bubble herself. So she would blame people for things. Often the blame would go on to me. So if she was in a lot of pain, her blame would go on to me. So I was experiencing the same projections. But it was only through my partner, who I had met before going into the Qliphoth, it was only through my partner that I was experiencing the opposite, a female energy that was actually accommodating and understanding my process, which was very, very rare. The process was so complex, the Qliphoth is complex, and my partner was giving the validation to my inner child that was needed to be able to experience the opposite. So many people experience trials that are resonant with the core trauma that they experienced, but these trials are ultimately going to present the opportunity to experience the opposite. Okay, and you have to take that opportunity if you are to not perpetuate in the same stuff. Now, Nahemoth was very much that, okay, the restructuring of my physical experience, also very erotic energy. You face a lot of, sexual desires and succubi that for me were coming up in the form of intense physical sensations and erotic energy and things like that. But Nahemoth was all about restructuring my reality, my physical experience, to be the right vessel to be able to carry me through the later stages of my initiation. And she did that by bringing me back into the same house that I was living in as a child, facing what I was avoiding and experiencing my mother slowly dying from cancer throughout the entirety of my Qliphothic initiation process. It sounds extreme, but again, you're not going to experience the same thing. This is because my core karma was around my mum, and I now know that we have different contracts, or we had different contracts on the level of the soul to act as karmic crucibles for each other. Okay, so it was deeply connected, and my partner throughout the Qliphothic process paid a very strong contribution into being a vessel for the energies and helping me to experience the opposite. And we are still together now after a lot of rupture in going through the Qliphoth, which I will get to later. So after my reality had been restructured by Naamah, I then moved into Gamaliel. And Gamaliel was very different, okay? Gamaliel was a very still energy for me, but had a lot of different psychological based perversions coming to the surface. Now, the way that I experienced Lilith and Naamah is Naamah being the physical aspect and Lilith being the psychological aspect. And that's exactly what Gamaliel is, the subconscious mind, the lunar energies. So I had a lot of different erotic sensations, but much more psychological and much more vivid in terms of visions. So I'd be just walking down the street and I would start to get visions of something immensely taboo, like violation or something like that, something immensely taboo. Lilith brings up various different succubi that are resonant with taboos, sexual taboos, to get you to process and integrate them. Okay, this is where I started to experience almost like a bit of tantric alchemy, whereby I experienced energy redistributing into the higher parts of my field from the lower sexual organs. Okay, so I started to experience a lot of tantric based things. And again, a lot of these initiations came through my partner, whereby I was becoming very open in our intimate life. And our intimate relationship became very sort of alchemical and very open beyond what I had experienced before. All of this going on while still experiencing day to day, my mother going through immense pain. You know, I couldn't see my partner that often because I had to be there for my mother. So when I would go and see my partner, it was kind of like a window to actually experience the opposite of the core enmeshment trauma that was being mirrored back to me in my day-to-day life constantly. Now, what happened in Gamaliel was also me being massively blamed by my mother, and this is exactly the sort of Lilithian energy, the dark feminine archetype. I was being blamed by my mother for the pain that she was going through in a way. Not directly, but she was looking for a scapegoat and looking for somebody to blame. And that came through in the form of basically blaming me and blaming my partner for me trying to honor my needs. So basically, whenever I put a boundary in place, which when somebody is dying from cancer, it's very, very, very difficult. Okay, whenever you know, you need to put a boundary in that place, particularly if you have enmeshment trauma. Like, putting those boundaries in place is difficult anyway, and when you do so, you normally experience a bit of backlash from it. And that's exactly what I was experiencing here, honoring my own needs whilst also being there for her, and very much learning how to, the word that's coming through is protect my life force, but it's not about, you know, protecting from external entities, but kind of, you know, basically treating my life force and the energy that I'm distributing as immensely sacred. So a lot of the initiations in Gamaliel were focused around being blamed by a wounded feminine archetype, but also having the opportunity and being rewarded when I put those boundaries in place by experiencing the opposite of the trauma that I had experienced in my past through my partner. Okay, so the first two spheres did definitely link together in nature. Okay, it's very interesting how different you might go outside and everything is like an archetypal mirror of the sphere that you are in. So I remember going outside a walk in the woods, and it was all dark and the trees felt all twisted and felt all expansive, and the kind of lunar energy was sort of shining through the trees, you know, all a kind of mirror of what was being experienced in Gamaliel, all a mirror of that literal experience. Now, when it came to Samael, okay, Samael, the sphere ruled by Adrammelech, the first sphere on the dark pillar of severity, Samael came through spontaneously. Now, I received a dream of initiating, very vividly initiating into Samael, and I woke up the next morning and felt like I was in Samael. I think it was an indication that I was ready to move to the next sphere, but originally I had a plan to stay within Lilith's sphere, Gamaliel, for an extensive period of time. But when it came to initiating into Samael, it became very clear that I was ready to move into that sphere. So after about a month, just over a month of being in Gamaliel, I then received that dream that I was initiating into Samael, and I initiated into Samael a few days later. As I initiated into Samael, the energies were immensely dissolving. Okay, I literally felt like my whole room was melting. It was almost like I was experiencing, like I'd taken acid or something. I was experiencing green fractals, and green is a core symbol in this realm. Green is a core symbol because of the symbolic poison. When you enter into Samael, you often experience drinking a symbolic sort of concoction of poison, and the idea is that it's poisoning your falsehood. Okay, so on the day that I initiated into Samael, my partner experienced a seizure. And she doesn't experience those very often, and she was tested neurologically. She hasn't got epilepsy, she hasn't got anything like that. She used to experience them as almost like a kind of psychic phenomenon where you enter into different states of consciousness through a seizure. And the day that I initiated into Samael, she experienced a seizure. Okay, and had deep gnosis into how people go insane. Okay, and this was a core theme within Samael. Okay, the gnosis of how people go insane, very tangible in the body. I was experiencing a bit of nausea here and there. I was also experiencing the energy so tangibly that I couldn't really concentrate on anything in day-to-day life. And I really just had to go into a space whereby I was just allowing things to unfold. Now, I experienced a lot of very interesting synchronicities in Samael. Now, synchronicities whereby I would go with my mum to a appointment with her oncologist, and my uncle, who is very religious, who I'm not close with at all, would come with us. And whilst I'm experiencing the dissolving energies of Samael in his car, he's playing like all of this Jesus religious music of praise the Lord, and we're all light and all things like this. Meanwhile, I'm just dissolving within the sphere of Samael, experiencing being in my mum's oncology appointment whilst in Samael was immensely dissolving because it was just bad news after bad news, all whilst the energy was just pulsing through my system. The most interesting synchronicity that I found within Samael was getting onto a train and a stranger coming and sitting near me, and then basically the stranger randomly shouting, Luke needs to be rebaptized. Luke needs to be rebaptized. Luke needs to be rebaptized. And I was like, what on earth? Like, that's literally like an expression of the adversarial essence of Samael right there. The poison of God literally speaking to me through a stranger on the train. And this happens, you know, you get different types of people that come into your reality that are like archetypal mirrors of a given experience that you are going through within that given sphere. Now, in Samael, the poison was also manifesting in the form of Kambo. Now, if you're familiar with Kambo, it's an Amazonian frog medicine that is burnt into the skin and it triggers a deep purgative process. So whilst I was in Samael, I was serving myself Kambo and experiencing a lot of purification through my work with Kambo. Okay, it's kind of like you're temporarily poisoning yourself, but the poison is very clearing to the lymphatic system and is very clearing to every aspect of the body in general, as long as you don't have any conditions. There are certain conditions, heart conditions, respiratory problems, things like that, that don't work well with Kambo whatsoever. But I was experiencing a lot of purification through Kambo. And again, it was just aligning for me to work with that particular frog poison, that particular physically purifying medicine, whilst I was in the sphere of Samael. So again, dissolving continuously happening within the world around me in terms of experiencing my mum at her oncology appointments, receiving bad news after bad news, watching her deteriorate day to day, whilst these individual things were happening with my partner. Samael was just a very dissolving and very tangible sphere overall. Now, when I got into Zaraq, this is when things got interesting. Zaraq for me was a very uncomfortable sphere. In fact, Zaraq was just immensely uncomfortable. We're talking about the inverted Venus ruled by Baal. And this is all about breaking out of external authority, dealing with the fruits of your ego on the level of coping mechanisms. Now, what I was experiencing in Zaraq was intense hypochondria. Okay, now hypochondria developed when I was a child in the form of anorexia. Okay, I would stop eating in order to gain control. And hypochondria manifested for me in a way of sort of trying to deal with or control the enmeshment dynamic that I was experiencing with my mum. So my mum would experience intense sensations with her cancer that was fungating, literally growing out of the neck. And I would then get sensations in that part of the body as well. It would get like a bulging sensation, okay, to the point where I was feeling immensely paranoid about my health, okay, immensely paranoid about my health. So what Baal was doing is that he was uprooting a lot of coping mechanisms surrounding hypochondria and the need to control my physical experience through trying to identify something that is wrong with me. Very dark, very distorted in nature. But all it was aspects of my inner child that were trying to comprehend the immense dissolving that was taking place. Now, I was so paranoid to the point where I thought that there was something growing on my tonsil, okay? And I was completely destabilized by this delusion, okay? You can experience delusions within the Qliphoth. And my delusion in Zaraq was thinking that I had cancer in my tonsil, much like how I was processing a lot of my mum's stuff whilst being at home. So I went to an ENT to get this checked out, and this ENT was so cold. Yeah, cold, just not like a nice open guy in any way whatsoever. And he said, okay, he looked at my tonsils. Clearly there was nothing wrong with my tonsils, but he said, okay, I'm going to cut into your tonsils anyway. That was a trial from Baal to say I don't need the biopsy, but I didn't actually say that I didn't need the biopsy and just let him take the biopsy. Okay, so he basically got this big spear looking thing, which normally a biopsy is like a small little penknife thing, right? Whereas with this, it was like a big spear, and Baal would appear to me in the astral as holding a big spear. So this was absolutely an archetypal trial that was orchestrated through Baal, and he literally cut into my tonsil, okay? Took a chunk out of my tonsil and said, okay, we'll send it to the lab and then we'll see. And I was like, okay, fine, that's okay. But when I got back home, I realized that he took a chunk out of the wrong part of the mouth. Okay, so where I was pointing was next to the tonsil. He took a chunk out of my literal tonsil. Okay, literally just ripped a part out of my tonsil for no apparent reason at all. It was not what I was pointing to. And then I was like, okay, I've got to invoke Baal and see what on earth is going on here. And it turned out that this was a paradoxical trial to create a literal wound in my mouth in order to show me the illusion of the hypochondria. So what then happened is that my hypochondria, my worry, redistributed from the area of my body that I was worried about and into this literal wound. And what that was there to do is actually transmute the hypochondria, okay? Transmute it and show me that it was fluid and that it only came up and was being directed or projected towards a certain part of the body. It was a crazy initiatory trial, but it was actually a very purifying one, and I did feel immediately better after, even though I had a really sore mouth from where I had the biopsy taken out of my tonsil. Okay, so other than that, there was also immensely dissolving sensations taking place at the same time every day. It really created the sensation in the sphere of Venus in a Zaraq that I was on like a treadmill, and it was kind of that Groundhog Day effect. Like everything was like a repeat of what had happened previously. Like every day was just a repeat of the last day. And because Baal and a Zaraq is about dealing with coping mechanisms and becoming a leader and stepping off of the illusionary treadmill of life, of striving towards something that doesn't exist, this was what I was being shown every day. I was being shown how every day, by default, is a repetitive technology that is there to take people away from the present moment. I was also experiencing very interesting synchronicities with crows, with swarms of crows following me around. If I switched like my computer on, I would see crows and all the kind of raven symbolism. It's known as the ravens of dispersion. So for me, Baal's sphere was the most intense out of the lower spheres, okay? The most intense sphere, and I was in there for about a month and a half. I was in there for an extensive period of time. Once I'd finished within Baal's sphere, I was very much experiencing day to day this kind of intense sensation of being cheated in a way, and that would manifest often in the form of family members who weren't really helping at all with my mum's situation. In other words, it was all landing on me, the son, to sort of support my mum when other family members weren't really doing much at all. Okay, and there was certain family members like my uncle who were saying, oh yeah, I'm going to help out, and then did absolutely jack shit. So for me, that was also manifesting in an intense anger whereby Baal would spontaneously possess my body to get me to express my unmet needs to various members of my family. Very, very intense, very, very tangible. Now, transitioning from Zaraq into Thagirion was a very, very interesting phase of the initiation. Now, moving into Thagirion is where you experience the first elevation in consciousness in your descent, or should I say ascent, up at the tree of death. Now, I went from the loud sensations of Baal into the quiet, eerily quiet sensation of Thagirion. Now, from the moment I entered Thagirion, I had just this quiet sensation, whereas Baal's sphere was just loud, intense, dissolving in every way possible. Thagirion, it just completely was quiet, almost like the sensation that any spirit guides were just kind of leaving, and it was like eerily quiet, very internal, but also extremely dissolving in the background. Now, everywhere I went physically within Thagirion was kind of deserted. I remember taking a walk with my partner to the park when I was there at some point, and it was in the middle of a Saturday, and the park was just empty. It was like a ghost town. Okay, and I remember going out like early evening, walking to the shops, and normally it's very busy, and it's just completely like there's nobody around, empty cars, and all kinds of eerie sensations. So Thagirion for me really created the sensation of being very alone, but was also, in my view, a very important resting point. Okay, it was like a resting point after the lower part of the tree, but is also where I started to get gnosis into the pretense of everything. Now, it was almost like a pre-experience to Daath, which is the abyss, which is directly up from Thagirion. This was almost like a premonition with Daath, whereby I was learning to see through pretense, and I started to get gnosis into how the majority of the occult community is pretense, how the majority of the spiritual community is pretense, and where I was pretending in my day-to-day life, okay, where I was holding on to different illusions of grandeur without really realizing it. Now, Thagirion for me, unlike the other spheres, did not bring any tangible trials. Okay, felt like I was being subtly tested by the ruler of the sphere, which is Belphegor. I was being subtly tested on how reliant I am on my own pretense, my own image, and my own illusion of grandeur. Now, this is where my hypochondria started to kind of settle a bit in this sphere, as I experienced the hypochondria at different stages in the process, okay? And again, day to day with my mum was just increasingly difficult. It was getting worse as her cancer was getting worse. She did have a bit of radiotherapy whilst I was in Thagirion, and it did actually help a little bit, but as a whole, it was just getting progressively worse, and again, continuously experiencing that sort of rupture in day-to-day life in terms of watching her suffer day to day. Now, in Thagirion, this is where my mum started to go through a more formal process of applying for euthanasia. Okay, and this is a process that legally I could not be involved with at all. Okay, and this was a very heavy situation. There was a company called Dignitas in Switzerland they're quite a well-known euthanasia company of assisted dying. And because my mum was in so much pain, she started to go through a process on her own, with me not involved, of preparing to go to Dignitas. So this was immensely heavy, where it was like experiencing day to day my mum going through immense pain, but then the very controversial and taboo area of dignitas and assisted dying, and not being able to be involved or helping her with the process at all because you can't legally. So Thagirion was where this really started to happen in quite an intense way, and where I started to really gain gnosis into that sort of antichrist consciousness, which is like being deliberately taboo, and topics such as euthanasia being discussed day to day was just an ongoing process within Thagirion. So the energy as a whole was very subtle, but very dissolving, by showing me how to see through pretense, seeing through my own bullshit, but also bringing the taboo to the surface, such as my mum considering assisted dying and actively going through that process of applying to go to Dignitas, because it's not easy to be euthanized. Okay, it's not an easy, straightforward process. You have to, A, it's very expensive, and B, it's an extensive process to prepare. You have to become a member. It's an extremely extensive process. and a process that I could not be involved in any way whatsoever legally. So, Thagirion to Golachab. Okay, now Golachab was a sphere that I was very anxious to enter because of all of the stuff that you hear about Golachab. Golachab, ruled by Asmodeus, facing your deepest and darkest desires, facing all things that are taboo on the level of human coping mechanisms, anger, rage, unmet needs, all of these things. I was anxious to enter Golachab. Now, from the moment I entered Golachab, I felt fire enter my body. It was very tangible from this very moment. And my mum at the time was using a Rife machine, which is it's like an alternative therapy frequency machine, and it makes sort of strange noises as it beams a frequency into the body that resonates with certain conditions. As soon as I entered into Golachab, the fire entered my body. The radiators in the house started making watery noises, okay? Literally like they were filling with water. It was bizarre, really bizarre from the moment I entered Golachab. I also went into the living room where my mother was receiving her Rife treatment, and the Rife machine was making an alarm sound, like a loud sort of factory-like alarm. It was going, and like I had never heard it make a sound like that. Normally it's like subtle, almost like, you know, tweaking light bulb sensations and sounds. But with this, it was like a loud sort of factory alarm. It was really surreal. And it was almost like everything around me was mirroring a deep internal emotional process that was also aligned to the enmeshment with my mum. So the radiators every day from that point, whilst in Golachab, would make crazy noises, constantly making noises of being filled with water, like really loud, very, very strange. But Golachab for me was actually a very pleasant process because this was where I had to come out of my shell. Okay, Golachab was where I had to start taking action to let myself be seen and actually start following my genuine passion, free from predefined obligation. And this was a very intense energy, but it was smooth for me because I wasn't resisting the call to align to passion. Now, Golachab, it has got all kinds of taboo energies associated with it. But what it is really about is freeing the inner child, embracing innocence, curiosity, and following your passion. So I feel that the types of trials that you receive in Golachab are really going to depend on how willing you are to actually follow your passion. Because the whole point of Golachab is that it shows you how when you don't follow your passion, your emotional needs are not met. And when your needs are not met, your inner child is imprisoned. And then it gets stuck and perpetuates in rage, anger, distorted fantasies, and all of these types of things that are mirrors of the repressed innocence. So Golachab really did bring up a lot of repressed energy. It's very tangible in the body, literally like I'm on fire. Very satisfying energy, but it really gave me the push to start following my passion, okay? It really gave me the push to start shifting my business entirely, moving into a membership format, and really sort of letting myself be seen fully. And that was very challenging, coming out of my shell. But I can see how if somebody is not willing to follow their passion and is not willing to actually meet the needs of their inner child, I can see how Golachab can get quite chaotic and quite overbearing by bringing you trials of physical confrontation. In other words, those types of trials, in my view, will only happen if you are not willing to actually meet the needs of your inner child, process your rage, and understand that rage comes from unmet needs, and that the real key to this sphere is actually following your passion. As I'm talking about Golachab, I can feel the sensations in my body just by talking about it, but this energy was immensely tangible and really gave me the push to start genuinely following my dreams. So it was a very important adversarial energy to embody for me. And ever since, I've had a very close bond with Asmodeus or Asmodei, who rules over the sphere of Golachab. So for me, Golachab was very tangible. And this is basically where my mother started to experience some improvements in her condition. She started to be able to eat again. She was receiving immunotherapy, which is given to people who are often terminally ill and is often seen as revolutionary for people with head and neck cancer. So she was receiving immunotherapy and was starting to experience benefits of that therapy and was starting to actually be able to function like somewhat like a normal human being again. So there was just a lot of dissolving, a lot of continuous trials when it came to my mother's enmeshment and being enmeshed into my mother's dynamic, and also more boundaries that needed to be put in place as well. This also triggered a lot of rupture with my partner. Our relationship was so fiery at the time. It was like everything we said to each other would just be misinterpreted by the other person. It's like Golachab was creating disagreements so that we can alchemize those disagreements and really fall into that deeper primordial sexual union that the Qliphoth has the agenda of moving you into. Absolutely fascinating concept. Now, moving from Golachab into Gha'agsheblah. Now, this was a turning point for many reasons because I got to Geburah on the Tree of Life before actually doing the Qliphoth, before starting the Qliphoth. So Geburah is the light aspect of Golachab. So from this point onwards, from Gha'agsheblah onwards, I was doing the Sephiroth and the Qliphoth together. So I actually entered into Gha'agsheblah, ruled by Astaroth, and Chesed, ruled by Zadkiel, at the same time. So initiating into the dark and light aspects of the sphere, which was immensely intense for the first few days. Now, Gha'agsheblah is the Jupiterian essence, which is where you are facing the inversion of abundance and illusionary desire. So for me, this was bringing forward a lot of rupture when it came to practical level things. I started to experience a lot of dissolution and sensations that everything that I was striving for in my life was completely illusionary. Okay, like I was entering like a fiery pit of desire that was almost like devouring the concept of desire and ambition altogether. Now, this did also come through in the form of old habits. For me, it was a lot around masturbation and sexual release. It was bringing up a lot of old habits and sort of excessive sexual desire at the time because you're facing your inverted abundance. You're facing the illusion of desire. So Gha'agsheblah often brings up a lot of different sensations, particularly repressed addictions and repressed coping mechanisms. So Astaroth was really taking me through that necessary trial of seeing through a lot of illusionary desires. Astrally, the sphere took on a very interesting appearance in terms of every time I would go in there, there would be loads of like a big open banquet table filled with loads of different treats and temptations and things like that. So this is where you really have to not fall into temptation and actually master the concept of desire as a whole. This is where the linear result of abundance is completely severed from your being. It is absolutely epic, but again, very challenging because you experience a lot of repressed emotions and repressed desires and habits that start to come to the surface within Gha'agsheblah in your own individual way. All of this whilst experiencing the openness and lovingness of Chesed. So it had literally two Jupiterian forces going on at once. But all of this was preparation. I spent about 6 weeks to 2 months, between 6 weeks and 2 months within Gha'agsheblah before entering into the Daath. Now, this is probably the most anticipated point in the initiation. This is where you've initiated through the lower 7 spheres, you've gone through the dissolving of the inner planets, now you have to rupture your predefined identity as you know it. Now, from the moment I entered Daath, nothing much really happened initially. Okay, so I did the initiatory ritual into Daath, felt the energy come in. For those who don't know, Daathic energy is very slow to work and is very progressive. I feel is quite resonant with Pluto, but there isn't really a planetary association with Daath. Just a very intense liminal energy. Now, I started to get the sensation that things were starting to make less and less sense, okay? Daath was very slow to work. It was like a gradual descent into the deeper aspects of self. And as this gradual descent was taking place, the first sensation I got after the first 2 weeks was very, very common. The typical trial of Choronzon, who is the beast of the abyss, who is your core initiator. Typical trial from Choronzon came through in the form of, oh, I don't think the abyss is doing much. I must have already crossed. Okay, very common mistake to make within the abyss is to think that you have crossed within the first 2 weeks. Big mistake. Okay, so I was like, okay, maybe I've crossed, but then I was like, okay, no, I'm just going to let things be. Then came the rupture. Okay, and the rupture for me was very significant. It was rupturing towards my business, rupturing towards my relationship, and towards my entire sense of self, or my predefined sense of self as you know it, or as I knew it. So the rupture came through a retreat that I was running. So I used to run shamanic training retreats, and this was what we call a West retreat, which is the Jaguar archetype. Okay, and the Jaguar archetype is a very dark archetype, okay? A lot of deep shadow work and death energy takes place here. It's just a very intense part of the initiation, and it's not unusual for Jaguar retreats or training retreats to bring up a lot of repressed energy and for things to be very heightened. So I went to do this do this retreat, but brought my partner with me. And from the moment of entering this space, which was my old mentor's house, country property, the same place I did the burial ritual before, or as I entered into the Qliphoth, but they were in the process of moving. So literally the furniture was starting to be moved and the whole house was in a liminal space. Okay, so it's literally like the pictures were taken off the walls. Like it was like an empty house. Okay, and this was so Daathic in nature, it was crazy. And from the moment of being there, I was thinking this is going to be something is going to go down at this retreat, and I just don't know what it is. So the next day came whereby the teachings began, and it was flowing okay initially. But then there was a rupture between my partner and one of my students. Okay, and the rupture was complicated. Okay, there was multi-layered, there was lots of things going on. Because of the Choronzonic energy and the Daathic energy that was present in the space, it was heightening the energy of the retreat quite significantly. And it was also triggering some quite extreme responses as well. Okay, so people in the journey state were having very sort of deep experiences. It was just amplifying the energy of the existingly intense retreat that is the Jaguar training. So basically, long story short, there was a dynamic that started to unfold between my partner and between a particular person at my training retreat. Okay, and this particular dynamic sort of played out in terms of my student basically attacking my partner in front of the group, but passively, and then my partner sort of retaliating in her own way that wasn't really helpful. Okay, so there was, in a sense, wrongdoings from both sides, and I had never been in this situation before. In fact, I had always prided myself on being able to hold a space whereby there's no drama. So Choronzon put this persona that I was creating to the test by bringing literal rupture into my environment, but rupture that would reflect through my partner and through my students as well. So literally I was having some of my biggest fears reflected back to me through basically holes being poked within my teaching style. Okay, holes being poked in the space that I was holding, which at the time was a very big aspect of my persona. Okay, being able to hold a space. But what I really learned from this process was that I was holding space in a way that was a mirror of my mother's enmeshment trauma. So the student whereby the drama actually took place, or the actual drama that took place within this particular student or between this student and my partner. I'd had this particular individual on other retreats as well, and there was always some form of drama that unfolded with this person, and in terms of being sort of feeling traumatized by another individual, it was always like somebody else's fault. It's just this time it was directed towards my partner, and then because I brought my partner along assisting in the retreat, it was then directed towards me. Whereas my previous sort of approach to that would be to basically try and validate the individual. Okay, and I did this not just with one person, but with a lot of people who entered my healing space, a lot of people who entered my mentoring programs. I would not actually help them. I would validate them because of my enmeshment trauma. And this is what Choronzon ruptured. Okay, it's the energy just built up and built up and built up throughout the retreat. It was immensely intense. It was just crazy. Okay, it was crazy. It was triggering continuous rupture between my partner and me. I felt that my partner wasn't responding in the way that she should have. My partner was then feeling that I wasn't responding in the way that I should have. Then my students were thinking that I wasn't responding in the way that I should have. It was literally like a triangulated sort of mess, basically, whereby this sort of resentment would just build up in the background. And it eventually led to a very, very big rupture, whereby I literally experienced Choronzon speaking to me through my students. Okay, and this happened not just at this retreat, but also after the retreat and before the retreat as well, with multiple people. In terms of saying, you're terrible at what you do, you're not holding a good space, you're awful at what you do, you're not holding a good space. Yeah, and like literally shattering like this sort of persona that I built around, catering for people and, validating people. And all of this was being like completely torn to shit at this retreat. It was just drama after drama after drama at this retreat. This is the thing. Yeah. And I felt after that retreat, like my entire view on my business was just completely ruptured. I was like, why have I even built my business? Am I just building it to validate people? My entire relationship after that, it was like completely ruptured in the sense of the old structure of my relationship was just completely torn to pieces by Choronzon. And I was left after it like, this is going to take me a long time to properly integrate. I was literally feeling after that retreat like I had literally had my balls pinned up against a wall and hammered by the energy of Choronzon. Okay, and abyssal trials are so intensely personal. They're so personal to the point where it's pointless even trying to explain it, almost, because what I'm experiencing, or what you're going to experience within the abyssal crossing, is so aligned to your personal process and your karma, to the point where it doesn't really do it justice speaking about it. It's like, it's very much like you have to go through it type of experience to be able to truly understand what it does. So after I went through that core Daathic rupture, I was just in no man's land for ages after that. Okay, I didn't have trust in my partner anymore. I didn't have trust in my business anymore. I didn't have trust in anything that I was doing after that retreat. I was just completely, like, every aspect that I was using to hide from myself was completely ruptured. Every aspect of it. Lies that I told to myself, lies that I had portrayed about myself, sort of portraying myself as more experienced than I actually am. All of that was just completely ruptured within this Daathic trial. And after was just a process of just total dissolution. Like, what even am I doing? And this is the point in the Daathic crossing whereby you really have to surrender, because the rupture has happened. And now you have to just embrace the hanged man archetype, just embrace the stillness, embrace the intensity. And when you're at the bottom of the abyss, you're kind of at a form of rock bottom. It's kind of like, this is where things get intense, because it's like you're not experiencing direct rupture anymore, but your energy field basically feels like you're in immense density, and there's nothing to do other than just to relax into it. Okay, I remember seeing a client, doing a mentoring session with a client whilst I was in the abyss, and I was like advising them, giving them good advice, but meanwhile, like, my whole body was being completely pounded by the Daathic energy. I was just like there, like, again, eyes flickering and things like that. That seems to be a common nervous system symptom for me when going through a big alchemical process. So as Daath continued, I started to feel gradually more grounded, gradually, okay? But the ruptures kind of continued in day to day, again, being blamed for things. And when I was in the abyss, interestingly, the situation with my mother it actually took a very positive turn. She started to feel really good in herself. She started to experience like tangible change as a result of the treatment she was having. And she was even saying things like, I think I'm going to be all right. I'm going to make it through this terminal diagnosis. And as I came out of the abyss, there was, like glimmer of hope. Okay, a glimmer of hope, which was actually very beautiful. And at this point, me and my partner were sort of trying to mend things, but there was still a lot of unexpressed energy. But, she was still around and we were still kind of in contact. And then I entered Satariel. Now, Satariel, the first sphere of the supernal triad in the Qliphoth, I didn't just enter Satariel, I entered Benar at the same time. Okay, and this is the Saturnian sphere in the Sephiroth. So I entered both the dark and light aspects of Saturn on the same night. Will I do it again? Would I do that again? No, I would not do that again, because it was a lot and it was it was the only point in the process where I thought I was going to lose my mind. Okay, so I enter Satariel and Binar, and I just start experiencing this immense distortion, like fog. Like the first few days were fine, but then up to the first week, I was like, I can't see shit. I was like, I can't see anything. You can see things physically, but it's like spiritual fog, okay? Ruled by Lucifuge Rofocale. Lucifuge Rofocale is he who flees from light. Okay, so he initiates you through disorientating you, taking your guiding light away, your external guiding light, so that you have nowhere else to turn but inside. Now, Satariel was a very intense energy on the body, so was Binar, going through both of them at the same time. This was where it's a difficult sphere, because you've just been through the abyss, and what's left is now going into the pressure cooker. And Satariel is like a pressure cooker, like you've got energy pressing on your system, and you just feel like you're under immense pressure. Now, all I was feeling is just lack of trust in everything, lack of trust in my spiritual path, sensation of why on earth I'm doing this in the first place. I don't understand myself. I don't understand why I'm doing this, and complete distrust in my partner at the time. Like, literally neither of us were expressing our emotions properly, and we weren't expressing our needs. I knew that I wasn't meeting her needs. And, because I was in such a deep process and I didn't even know what I was going through myself, it was impossible for her to possibly comprehend what I was going through in any way whatsoever. She was able to tune in, and she was, trying to be really supportive in that period. But again, I just wasn't hearing it. Yeah, I was just like, I, in a way, started to blame my partner. And this is where the real rupture of my karma started to take place, whereby I was kind of at a crossroads where I had to choose between separation consciousness and vulnerability. Okay, vulnerability was letting all of my needs be seen by my partner. And the separation consciousness would have been trying to separate myself and scapegoat the partner. And initially, I fell into separation. Okay, I left the relationship and, may I add, broke my partner's heart in doing so. I just left the relationship because after what happened in the abyss, I had absolutely no trust in anything anymore. I had no trust in my process, and I definitely didn't have trust in anybody else. So I fell into separation in Satariel. Okay, it fell completely into separation, back into my narcissistic bubble. And this is where things had the potential to get extremely re-traumatizing. Okay, now once this had happened, the energy started to settle down a bit. I was about 6 weeks into Satariel and Binar now. And after I had gone through that process, things started to settle down. Okay, I started to experience a little bit more grounding, but my body was still responding. My body was in shock after Satariel. Okay, after Satariel and Binar, my body was just completely in shock. I had a lymph node that popped up here and like other sensations. I also like had tonsil stones as well, which is where like pus starts leaking out of your tonsils on the same side that my mother's cancer was. And the day I entered into Satariel was the day my mother started to experience a decline in her health. Again, after a period of thinking she's going to make it, her health massively declined. Okay, basically the immunotherapy, because of her own process, the immunotherapy started to attack her liver, and she started to experience adverse effects from the only cancer treatment that she was receiving as a terminally ill person. So it was full of all kinds of trials like that. And then moving into Ghagiel. Now, I did not enter Ghagiel and Hokmar at the same time. Lesson learned after Satariel and Binar. I entered into Ghagiel, went through that process, and then went into Hokmar. Now, going into Ghagiel, I was anticipating this process greatly because of how much of a good relationship I had with Beelzebub. And Beelzebub, I think before then, I think I was in a Zaraq. I made Beelzebub, I did an official ritual to take Beelzebub as my patron demon of the Qliphoth, and therefore I had a very strong connection with Beelzebub before going into Ghagiel. Now, Ghagiel was where I started to get the sensation that everything was a mirage, okay? Initially getting tested through sexual desire, getting tested through other desires, getting tested through illusionary desires around business, and all kinds of things like this. Ghagiel came through in the form of the classic false illumination, okay? Thinking that I had come further than I have after Satariel, and actually thinking that I had done the right thing by leaving the relationship with my partner. Okay, thinking that I'd done the right thing by living in separation. Okay, and Ghagiel quickly ruptured this illusion. Okay, and the sensation that I was getting, I was being very hot and cold with my partner at the time, in terms of, again, making lots of mistakes, in terms of, okay, I'm ready to be in this relationship, and then she would adjust to that, and then I'd be like, no, this whole relationship is a mirage. Bless her heart. She really stuck with me in that process. You know, she stuck with me in that process as I was going through this really important purification of my karma. But I was being tested through seeing through my own illusion of separation in Ghagiel, okay? And to me, the separation, my narcissistic bubble, was like an apple. It looked beautiful and amazing, but when I bit into that apple, it was rotting at its core. And this is the lesson of Ghagiel. The core aspects or the core things that you're processing within the sphere are basically like falsehood, false leadership, illusions, thought forms, constructs that you built to keep yourself safe from trauma. Like constructs of being a consumer in the reality around you, constructs of following somebody else, all kinds of things like this is what you are facing within Ghagiel. But towards the end of Ghagiel, the sensation that I got was, oh my God, I suddenly saw clearly what was happening. I was falling into separation consciousness, okay? And Ghagiel was the turning point for me because I saw what my soul wanted, okay? It was literally like I was veiled. Ever since entering the abyss, I was in this veil of illusion. And then as those veils of illusion started to crack and crumble, I started to see things as they are. I literally describe it as Ghagiel being like a big city full of all of these urban constructs, but the urban constructs started to crumble. And then I started to see the sunlight, the illumination that was on the other side of it. And at that point, I was like, I am choosing separation. My soul wants vulnerability. So very quickly, me and my partner got back together. And we had been through at that point a massive purification. Okay, massive purification whereby we separated for the purpose, now I see the higher purpose of seeing through separation. We separated for the purpose of going through individuation. And then when that process had concluded, or that wave had concluded, we came back together and we were able to really see through like the illusions that I had created, but also the illusions that she had created. Okay, and then I entered Hokmar and experienced beautiful illumination. Beautiful illumination after experiencing the rupture of Ghagiel. I literally started to feel in touch with my soul again, in touch with my divinity again, and it was just an amazing feeling altogether. Okay, this is where the real transformation, this is where the real results of my process in the Qliphoth started to actually come through. Then I entered Thaumiel, okay, and I did the same thing with Hokmar and Ghagiel. I did the same thing as I did with Hokmar and Ghagiel. I entered Thaumiel, the top sphere of Qliphoth, and then when I was done with that, I entered into Kether, the top sphere of the Tree of Life. Now, Thaumiel was a very interesting sphere. Initially, there was a very strong sensation of the pineal gland opening up, like a very strong, like crown sensation, because we are talking about the crown, the inversion of the crown, the separation consciousness in its totality. Ruled by Satan and Moloch, I was greeted by Lucifer and crowned with the fractured crown, which then started to decalcify aspects of my pineal gland. So I experienced massive refinements in psychic abilities following the Thaumiel initiation. But Thaumiel was not as many people thought. Okay, this is where the beginning of the end started to unfold for my old identity structure. In other words, my mother started to make a conscious decision that she was definitely going to be euthanized. Okay, and that was a very big hit for me. And this was basically the start of things in regards to our enmeshment dynamic starting to conclude. Okay, so I went into Thaumiel and I did not experience the illumination of Thaumiel that many people claim to experience. It was not a victorious process for me by any means. Yes, I did get the sensation that I've done an awful lot of work and that I had done really well, but it was a hollow victory for me in the sense because I knew of all of the chaos that was happening in my life surrounding my mum and all of the change that I've been through. I knew that this was only the beginning. Like I felt like I was only getting started when I entered into the sphere of Thaumiel. And the sensation that I was getting in Thaumiel was a very big fluctuation in feelings and emotions and expression. And this was literally the sensation that Satan and Moloch, who are the twin gods who rule Thaumiel, Satan and Moloch were basically fighting for my vessel. That's what it felt like. Okay, when Satan would possess my body, I would start to feel sovereign and start to feel that pure adversarial empowerment. But then when Satan was knocked out the way and Moloch took the throne, I would start to get the sensation of hating everybody. I hate the world. I hate this. I hate everybody. Separation consciousness, right? Literally battling between alternate current and direct current, okay? AC, DC, Satan, Moloch, Satan, Moloch, Satan, Moloch. The purpose is to find the equilibrium between them and learn how to use both forces. That's when you shift into harmony with the unity of Kether, when you start to experience the equilibrium. So initially, entering Thaumiel, it was a hollow victory, and Satan and Moloch were literally causing drastic shifts in energy. Occult bipolar is what I called it at the time. I was shifting from one to the other, all whilst experiencing my mum preparing to go to be euthanized without me helping her whatsoever because I couldn't legally do it. She had to do it all on her own. Okay. So again, just constant conflict. Okay. There was just conflict in this sphere. And then as I got to the end of Thaumiel, there wasn't really, I mean, other than refined psychic abilities and greater perceptions of the spirit world and energy, I didn't experience a massive amount of conscious illumination. It was kind of an internal process, but I did not experience what many people said that they experienced when they reached Thaumiel. I did not experience the victory. I experienced the sensation of, oh God, it is just getting started. Okay, and then I entered Kether, went through the unity of Kether, And then the process of dropping back to the bottom of the tree started to unfold. And this is where I started to get quite under the weather. Also, whilst I was in Thaumiel, I was also getting experiences of basically being prompted to go outside of myself, go to a workshop. I went to a very interesting workshop, but the workshop was literally a mirror of Satan and Moloch, the opposing forces. The teacher would say one thing and then completely contradict themselves. So there was a lot of that kind of energy going on. Just very, very conflicting energy was Thaumiel bringing for me. But when I started to shoot back to the bottom of the tree, I got quite under the weather. I think I got a cold, quite an intense cold for a few weeks, whilst everything was crystallizing back into the body. As soon as that happened, I started to feel things unfolding into the void beyond the Qliphoth. So I let things settle for a while. And then I entered into the first stellar outland, okay, which is in Enoch Petrocelli's system. The first stellar outland is the first region that resides outside of the tree structure itself. And this was the beginning of the end. Okay, this outland is called Death. And this is what I describe as the total death of everything that happened in the Qliphoth. Because I entered into the outland called Death. And this was when my mother suddenly got a date to go to Dignitas to be euthanized. So I had to make the most of my time with my mother in that time. And then, whilst in this outland called Death, everything in the Qliphoth consolidated. I said goodbye to my mum in the most taboo way possible. She got into the car, drove off, got the plane to Switzerland, and never came back. That was the beginning of the end. That was whereby once that had took place and once she had passed through the euthanasia in Switzerland, that was when I experienced the complete dissolving of everything that the Qliphoth was rupturing and was thrusted into formlessness and into a plane which was not tangible by any means. And that is when the process that I am in now, the ongoing process through the trans-Qliphothic void of learning to navigate reality without a predefined sense of self and without the enmeshment trauma of my mother dynamic. And this is an event that is being processed at this moment in time. I'm processing it as I'm going through my path workings, taking time in stillness every day, trying to welcome the energies, welcome the emotions. Very powerful, very dense, very dissolving, but utterly life-changing. Setting the foundation for an existence which is beyond all structure, all predefined structure and form. That was my process through the Qliphothic sphere workings. There's much more stuff as well, okay? If you're going through this process, literally make a journal or something, okay? Make a journal so that you can keep track, because it is a bit of a whirlwind. There is a lot more stuff that I could describe in terms of the individual days that I went through in each sphere, but that is an overview of my initiatory process, of my experiences going through the Qliphothic spheres. And my process is far from over. I'm only just getting started. So if you're watching thus far, I thank you for your openness and receptivity in receiving my experiences. I hope that this content was helpful to you. Don't forget to check out my Patreon, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.